Hi, I'm Hope Dector. I'm the creative director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women, and I'm here to welcome you to Organizing Transformative Justice Responses to Gender-Based Violence and Campus Sexual Violence, featuring Xhercis Méndez in conversation with Dean Spade. I will keep my remarks as brief as possible, but I want to offer some notes of thanks and accessibility information before I turn things over. First, a land acknowledgement. Tonight's event is taking place online, but we are all physically located someplace, and we recognize that all land is Indigenous land. Barnard College is located on the traditional ancestral territories of the Lenape people. In terms of accessibility, you can find a link to access live transcription for this event directly under the video in the YouTube video description. Thank you to Rebecca Koster from Total Caption for providing the live transcription. Our ASL interpreters for tonight's event are Marina Martinez-Cora and Jonathan Martinez-Marquez. Thank you both for providing this essential service. Another thing we'll be doing tonight for accessibility is visual descriptions. Each of our speakers will self-describe. I'll model that now. I'm a genderqueer looking white person with short dark hair and brown eyes. I am wearing a navy blue sweater and I'm sitting in front of a dark blue wall. We are planning for tonight's conversation to take place for 1.5 hours, ending around 8:30 Eastern Time, 5:30 Pacific. If you have a question for our speakers tonight, you can type it into the YouTube chat. We'll be collecting any questions there for the Q&A that will take place towards the end of the event. This event is made possible by the Patricia Weismer Professorship in Gender and Diversity at Seattle University. Special thanks to Natasha Martin and Teresa Ehrenfeit at Seattle University. I also want to thank my coworkers at BCRW for all of their work, including Elizabeth Castelli, Pam Phillips, Avi Cummings, Miriam Neptune, and especially Sophie Kreitzberg, the work that goes into these events behind the scenes, including managing the social media and communications during the event. And to BCRW student research assistant Mila Cooper, who is working with Sophie behind the scenes tonight. BCRW has recently completed most of our exciting lineup of spring programming. On our website or YouTube channel, you can find videos of those events, including another event we did in partnership with Seattle University called Abolition on the Ground, reporting from the movement to defund the police, featuring Dean Spade in conversation with Angelica Chazaro, Erica Perry, and Andrea Ritchie. You can also find videos from Dean's recent workshop series on building capacity for mutual aid groups there. BCRW has one final event lined up for the semester, which will take place next Tuesday, May 3rd, and is organized by Barnard student and activist photographer Amanda Taylor, who will be in conversation with leading LGBTQ+ mobilizers who are creating networks of visibility and support for queer and trans life in Jamaica and beyond. More information and registration for that event can be found at bcrw.barnard.edu. And now I'm happy to introduce you to our two speakers, Xhercis Méndez and Dean Spade. Xhercis Méndez is an associate professor in women and gender studies and queer studies and an affiliated faculty of African American studies at California State University, Fullerton. She is an organizer, activist, transdisciplinary scholar, and decolonial feminist, whose research focuses on developing decolonial feminist practices and methodologies for expanding our liberatory imaginations and building towards transformative justice. She's the founder of the University TJ Project, which works with faculty, staff, and administrators at institutions of higher education nationally to build local capacity to better respond to systemic harm, create adaptable accountability models, and expand the healing options available for a diverse range of survivors. Dean Spade is a former resident and longtime collaborator with BCRW, most recently producing the Building Capacity for Mutual Aid Groups workshops and video series. Dean has also worked with BCRW to create videos and programming on prison abolition, queer liberation, disability justice, and transformative justice. Dean is the author of Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next, as well as Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of the Law. Dean teaches at Seattle University School of Law and has been working in social movements to end prisons, borders, poverty, and war for over 2 decades. Welcome, Xhercis and Dean.
Thanks so much, Hope.
Yes. Thank you for having us.
So grateful to be here and get to do this event. I want to especially thank Hope and Sophie, who are always putting on these incredible events and making all this happen, and our interpreters and captioner. And I also wanted to share that I'm calling in from Portland, Oregon, which is on the lands of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook, Kalapuya, and Malala people. Thanks for spelling all that, Marina. So yeah, I wanted to share a few words about why I asked Xhercis to do this event, in case that's useful context. As I think we all are aware, gender and sexual violence is endemic in our society and on campuses and in every other kind of institution that we are all participating in. And in particular, I've noticed that campus responses to gender and sexual violence mirror the prosecutorial approaches that we see in the broader world that abolitionist feminists have been arguing don't work for a very long time. The campus responses that are in place everywhere that I've been involved on a campus do nothing to address or prevent campus sexual violence and gender violence, and they have the same dangers of targeting particular types of people for prosecution and missing lots of people who are engaging in the work. So they're just very reactive. They tend to silence survivors. They don't tend to be building deep support for changing the way our relationships work and making people safer. And that's a source of frustration to students and community members of all kinds. Transformative justice frameworks are really essential to rethinking this. What I mean when I say transformative justice, and I can't wait to talk to Xhercis about how she thinks about that term, but to me, transformative justice work is the work that lots of different people are doing to prevent and address violence, not using the policing system or the courts. Just realizing those things are part of the violence or increase it, and saying what are the practical solutions that would actually prevent people from having these experiences, change our culture so that those kinds of violence aren't endemic, and help people when those things are identified as happening or having had happened, figure out how to make it stop and not happen again, and heal as much as possible from what has gone on. I learned about Xhercis's current work at a gathering that Miriam Kaba put on about transformative justice with BCRW. And when Xhercis and I talked, she told me that she was working at Michigan State University in the wake of the exposure of Larry Nassar's abuse of gymnasts, right? Larry Nassar was located at that university, and that she was helping the university think and act in a very broad-based way to figure out how to address sexual and gender harassment and violence beyond the limits of the Title IX system, which is the thing that universities have to have legally in place. That's kind of this limited prosecutorial frame. And when Xhercis told me what she was doing, I was like, this is the largest scale transformative justice work in an institution that I've ever heard of anyone trying in my own travels of studying this work. And I thought, it felt really essential to have more places where Xhercis could share what she is learning with more people, because we're all dying to know what she's learning, because it's she's so deeply skilled and experienced doing this work on lots of campuses and lots of institutions, and is doing it at this scale that we haven't had enough people get to practice before. And I just have worked with people on so many campuses who are like, there must be another way to have a more effective approach to this problem than what is offered through the Title IX framework and the limits of what most universities are doing, so much of which just feels like it's about like covering their asses, not about actually making people safer or drastically changing the social relations that we've all been mired in. So, I mean, I'm also, really hoping Xhercis will share all of this wisdom in many forthcoming articles and books and webinars. And I know all of that will happen, but I just was really hungry to have a public conversation with Xhercis about how it's going and what she's learning. So that is kind of what got us. And then I got this Wismer professorship through Seattle U, where I got to put on a couple events, and I was like, this has to be one of them. It's my dream event. So that's how we come to be here together this evening. And I would love to give Xhercis a chance to make her land acknowledgement. And also, if you want to start out, Xhercis, just telling us a bit about how you got into transformative justice work, or what that means to you for anyone who's like new to the concept. I gave my like brief description, but maybe you could fill that out more.
Yes, thank you so much for that context, Dean. So I'm going to go ahead and start out by saying I live and work in the ancestral territories of the Tongva, Quiche, and Ashaman peoples. I am a light-skinned, femme-presenting Latina with long curly brown hair, with blonde highlights, and I'm wearing a light blue blouse with a patterned blazer and large gold earrings. Okay. So in terms of this project, as you mentioned, Dean, I did start this project in the aftermath of the Larry Nassar case. But transformative justice, the practices that are attached to it, I've been doing for a long time. And part of it is comes from my own history of, the criminalization of poverty that I grew up with, right? Where as a young person, my mom doesn't speak English, but I was navigating a lot of systems from welfare to child protective services, and interfacing with a lot of the surveillance strategies that they were using. Not to mention the history of incarceration in my family, from my great-grandfather to my grandfather to my brothers, and the ways in which that criminalization and engagement with police differed along the differing racial lines. So I'm Puerto Rican, and I have a very light-skinned, blue-eyed, white-passing brother, and then I have a brother that's very brown and smaller, and he's taken the lion's share brunt of that criminalization. And in addition to that, often being, sort of tapped to interface with lawyers when people in my community caught cases in different ways. So I've been interfacing with systems and laws and police for a long, long time. And then as I went through university, I started getting more politicized with the emergence of harm-free zones and all of this work that was happening in New York City, because I was up in upstate New York. So I've been politicized through that process. So by the time I got to MSU and was really questioning Title IX, in part because I was doing a lot of women gender studies stuff, I often found myself in a position where people wanted to divulge that type of information. And here I was yet again in this tense relationship with mandated reporting, this non-consensual I like to hit that part, non-consensual relationship to the state, and really frustrated because what survivors were asking for, what I have wanted in my own story of survivorship, has been to have a response that addresses the behavior, but doesn't necessarily put more people that I care about, funnel more people into that system. So when I think about TJ and transformative justice, I think about it as a philosophy and as an ethic and as a set of practices that's really trying to get to the root causes of harm, that really prioritizes healing and support as opposed to punishment, which really works against actual accountability, right? And I really think about it as, a politic that is future facing, that seeks to learn from conflict and doesn't seek to give our power away to name what harm is and to name what we think justice is to the state or to any other punishment system. So that's how I think about it. And it's really interesting to think about how that can operate in a university, because to the truth be told, the university is very much governed by laws. And it is the antithesis of community, right? If we're thinking about people coming together to figure out what justice is as a community, then part of the work is actually building community relationships instead of presuming that they're ready-made, which universities love to do.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I realized I forgot to do my image description. I'm always learning how to do better at that. I'm a white, dark-haired trans person with a mustache sitting on a porch that's like a rust-colored wall behind me, wearing a plaid shirt. Thank you so much, Xhercis. That's really helpful context. Also, your own experiences that gave you that wisdom. I think that's just really useful for us. I was wondering, just like along these lines, as we kind of make the ground to have this conversation, can you tell us what you think like the root causes of sexual violence and harm are, like on campus or more generally, like, however you think about that? I think that's like something that doesn't get discussed that much in a society that wants us to think it's like a few bad people as opposed to something like that's really endemic.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of roots when we think about a university space. I mean, first, we're operating in a society that discourages sex positivity, that discourages nuanced conversations about consent that include things like race and power as part of those conversations. We see that in the context of university spaces because depending on where you are situated as a student, you could be a very grown person at the university as a grad student, for instance, and find yourself in a relationship with a professor, for example, where you're similar age, but there are power dynamics involved. So we have to have much more nuanced conversations about how race operates in these contexts, how power operates in these contexts. But for a lot of us, many of us are coming to these spaces where we're leaving our communities behind. And so one place where harm happens is that you enter a space where you may not have any people, right? And so that's already, I like to think about it as conditions that enable harm, right? So one condition is that not just students, but often faculty are leaving their communities to come to these university spaces and find themselves very disconnected. That disconnection makes room for harm to happen and for a lack of accountability on the other side, because folks are experimenting, right? Because they don't know people. They get to, be whoever. I think that the other thing is that the university itself has a real, it's almost like it cultivates indifference and this idea of non-intervention, right? Like you're out here doing your own thing, you're doing your own thing. And so that is part of how the university operates, which cultivates a lack of accountability in general. I think in terms of other conditions, folks are really not skilled up. Folks are not skilled up around general conflict, right? General daily things, daily harms that we witness in real time in university spaces, like microaggressions, misgendering. Folks witness it, don't intervene, don't know how. They are conflict averse. They don't know how to navigate their own conflict aversion to really start to think about what does it look like to create spaces of belonging, spaces of safety, right? Spaces where folks know that they have backup. And I've noticed this a lot in virtual spaces where things happen and it's not clear whose responsibility it is to intervene. And the folks who are earmarked to intervene are severely under-resourced. So we have all the perfect conditions, the perfect storm for a lot of harm to happen. And depending on where the university is situated, if it's a like a college town, you may be experiencing harm within the institution or within the community that surrounds it. So the university sometimes operates as if it's bordered or something, but have no way of thinking about harm that happens just right outside its walls. So there's a perfect storm of conditions that really contribute to survivors finding themselves without support over and over and over again.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that. I'm just reminded, like, something that really changed my life, probably 10 or 15 years ago, was a conversation I had with Tourmaline, who also has worked a lot with BCRW, and about where she identified to me that she feels like isolation is the most dangerous thing for people. And yes. We were talking about, trans community, but like, I just see that again and again. And I really appreciate you describing how the setting of the university in which people kind of often move or turn up at this place where they may not have any contacts. A lot of my students really struggle to make friends even before COVID. Mm-hmm. Just are struggling, are like in this new space. And so if something happens, like they start dating someone and there's dating violence, or like the relationship's messed up, like they don't have anyone to confide in. The mm-hmm. university doesn't create any spaces besides really formal spaces. Like you could mm-hmm. do the Title IX route, or you could go to campus counseling if you can get an appointment, which always has a wait list, which is like at every university. But there's not like this year for the first time, students created a survivor support space, which is really as a mutual aid project, but that is so rare. And so there's this kind of like you're saying, like baked in isolation. And you see the same thing with faculty and staff, where it's like there's super intense power dynamics. Someone who's determining whether you're going to have a job next year, if they are harassing you or harming you, like who could you really tell safely? How would you know if you could tell anyone? Is there anyone here you can trust? Do you feel like I just really like that isolation. And the ways that the university pits people against each other, like students are competing for grades, faculty are competing for status, like all those isolating factors that make it so that I guess I just think of like sexual and dating violence as something that like any of us could stumble into. Yes. And what happened, what's going on in our lives before and during that might make it get further, or like be more dangerous, or be more isolating, or traumatizing. And that like being out of place from any community is like such a setup. So I really appreciate you naming that.
Yeah. And it's compounded. I would say it's compounded by the fact that many faculty of color are entering spaces where it isn't just that we don't know anyone. It's that some of the folks who have, like, at least at my institution, the most senior faculty are all white. They are, whether we like it or not. If I make it to full, I would be the first Latina to make it to full in my department in its history, right? So like things like that also compound, because then it makes it harder. There's a lack of believability for certain kinds of survivors. It's not really set up to look at dating violence or harm between differently gendered survivors. Like really, there's a lot of problems with the Title IX process, and it is the only thing that's on the menu.
Yeah, will you say more about that? I think I'm not assuming people know what Title IX is. And, maybe if you work at a university, you've had to have some training, maybe. But if you are a student, you might not even know what it is, or maybe it's written somewhere in your student handbook. Or if you're a person in the world, you might have no reason to know what Title IX is. But it is like such a good, it's something similar exists in a lot of ways in our society. But will you say kind of what you've seen to be, in as much detail as you want, like what are the limits of it? How's it supposed to work? Why doesn't it work?
Yeah, so there's a lot of problems with the Title IX approach. I think just as we think about it just from the beginning, I mean, really, we're not very clear. We're not very clear about what constitutes evidence of sex discrimination in these cases, right? Like what exactly constitutes evidence that you've been denied access to education as a result of sexual violence or sexual harm. And I think what ends up happening is that the institution needs to wait. It's reactive. It's not preventative, right? So it's only in the aftermath of harm that it's, quote, available. And we're supposed to wait till something is repetitive and egregious enough to be considered a legal violation in order for the institution to react. So we're out here telling many people, many students, if you think something is a violation, report. And what we've ended up with is an enormous backlog of cases that are now increasingly being outsourced to lawyers, right? External lawyers, not the Title IX person that's in the institution. And then the waiting times are long, only to come back no finding, which is what I'm seeing all over the place. These cases are coming back no finding over and over and over again. And what that conveys to people is that nothing happened here, right? So you could see how immediately someone who's being accused of something might say, okay, no finding there. I didn't do anything wrong. And so from my perspective, that really actually affords us an interesting opportunity. And this is where I kind of have been thinking creatively with the folks at MSU. So we've been taking what we call the gray cases, right? And thinking about, well, where are the opportunities for us to say, Title IX, you took your shot, you said no finding. And so now we get a chance to say, just because you didn't think anything happened doesn't mean nothing happened. We have an opportunity to learn something from this. We can start to have conversations about what this means for our community and for the people who filed this report with an enormous amount of hope, because that's the other thing that we're doing. And that's part of the thing that I think is harmful. You can't give survivors a bunch of hope and then drop them, right? And tell them that that is the only thing available to them. And that's where the resources are attached. And then these officers are completely underfunded, but that's all where the funding is going. So it's like both and, right? Like they are underfunded, yes, and that's the only place where money is going for this kind of work. And so what you're seeing nationally is these high turnover rates with these Title IX folks getting very burnt out. And it's hard because, I mean, as I've worked with folks, I see like, it's not that they have bad intentions. They're not trying to cause harm, but they're set up that way to do so. And so there's a lot of issues with Title IX as it currently stands. And to me, there's not enough happening around the preventative work and what it means to skill people up to respond when folks get dropped and or don't want to report, because for a lot of good reasons. There's a lot of good reasons why people may not want to go through that channel. But then if they don't go through that channel, they don't have anything, right? So I'm not an advocate of leaving people out here with nothing. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when I think about Title IX, it feels like like we live in an authoritarian society that you see it in universities, the response is like, oh, there's a lot of racism in the university. We'll have one DEI officer, or there's a lot of sexual violence. We'll have one Title IX. It's like, we love to create like a top dog who's supposed to resolve it. And you cannot resolve something like institutional white supremacy or endemic sexual violence with like a person you go to, like, are you kidding? Like, and then especially we love like an investigative process modeled on our criminal punishment system, which you get no findings all the time, which our whole criminal punishment system has this wild history of minimizing sexual violence and saying it's not happening, except for in a very few cases in which we throw the book at people, like this combination of minimization of most of the harm, and then occasional like examples where we're going to heavily punish one person. And that actually lets the whole thing keep going, in which it's sexual violence is normal in our society. It's just like everywhere. So I guess let's just a little bit maybe talk about prevention, because I think that's something that a lot of people can't, like, we're not even supposed to think about prevention when we think about violence and harm in our society, because we're supposed to just think about punishment obsessively, because that justifies the kind of system we have. So like, can you share some of, anywhere, universities or not, like, how do people like, what are like ways people work to prevent and transform? Because hiring one person and saying this person's going to fix the racism or this person's going to fix the sexual violence is like an utterly non-preventative response. So like, how would anybody ever work collectively to prevent this kind of harm and violence? And what have you seen?
Yeah. So some of the things, I think the most important thing to do is sort of maybe talk about some of the strategies that we've been trying to implement, and how they shift depending on where we're working, right? So the first thing that I focus on, which I think is really important, is that Title IX is mostly set up and presumes student-to-student harm. Okay. What's been powerful about the Nassar case and about the explosion of cases nationally where faculty and staff are the ones actually causing harm is you get to see that it's not set up to see that, right? So one of the things that I've been doing is I focus less on students and I focus on faculty and staff and skilling those folks up. Because the work that we're doing is we're saying we have to change the culture here. And the people who create the culture are the people who stay at the institution. Part of the issue with focusing on students is that they cycle in and they cycle out. So it's not that students aren't important or that they don't need to be skilled up, but that they're turning to faculty and staff who are not ready to hold them in any way, shape, or form. They have not been given those skills in any part of their preparation. So we've been focusing on the people that stay. And some of the ways in which we've been doing that is building up their relationships, because one of the things that we see is that the more disconnected a faculty member gets, and we see this all over the place when there's a lot of prestige, that they're like not even, that they're completely unaccountable, right? They have no way of, sort of being brought to want to change their behavior at all. So we've been connecting people through relationship building and really doing, running case scenarios in the aftermath of things that are happening in there. So part of the goal is to start cutting your teeth on low-level problems, but really building up your repertoire to be able to think with others on how you're going to respond based on whatever people you have in that space, whatever resources you have in that space, and really mobilizing them. So I'll give you some examples of things that have happened in the spaces that I've worked with. So in the aftermath of a no finding, something that is very common is that they ask deans to just be like, you did your due diligence by filing the Title IX and it's done. Do not communicate with the survivors in the aftermath of that no finding. But we have deans who are like, we don't agree with this no finding. So, being able to create a pod of deans that are talking to each other to question this policy that's coming down from the Office of General Counsel that is censoring them from communicating with survivors and saying, just because Title IX didn't find that there's any work to do here doesn't mean my college doesn't think there's work to be done here. And what does that work mean, or what does that work need to be? Some of that could be, with the survivor's consent, figuring out, hey, what needs to change in my college, even if Title IX said there was nothing wrong. So really saying, this is community responsibility. Where have we failed you in terms of safety, in terms of giving you dignity, in terms of giving you agency to decide what you needed? Where have we failed you in terms of giving you a sense of belonging? What kind of community conversations can we have in-house to prevent this from happening in the future? Office of General Counsel says you can't do that. And for the most part, deans have been taught to follow the rules. But having a pod of deans that say, why? Give us a legal reason. You have, that's the kind of stuff that's happening at MSU and at other places where people are starting to talk back to these collectivities that have said you're not allowed to do X, Y, Z, and they followed the rules without asking questions. So people are starting to ask questions and organize to say, no, is this a perceived concern with liability, or what is the actual violation here for us to express care to our students and our people? And that doesn't make any sense. So that's one example. But there's other examples where, say, and I'll give you an example of, like, if I'm working with a unit that would be like a theater department, for example, a theater department that's having problems of, harassment, because listen, I was an actress, so I totally get this. You're in a rehearsal space, it's late, stuff happens, you're traveling. There's a lot of spaces where things can go down that we are not prepping students the way we should be. So I've come in and been like, hey, let's talk about what the community agreements are in spaces where faculty are not around. What is I call them, the fire drills. We have fire drills. We have earthquake drills in California, right? But we don't have sexual assault drills. So what happens when people are traveling to go do a performance and they're drinking and they're at a hotel and they don't know anyone? Can we create safety protocols that people will know, if this thing happens, I'm going to call this person? People have their, in case of emergency, contacts exchanged with the people that they're traveling with. They have an idea of where the local hospital is in any site that they're going to. They have contact people to turn to if things pop off while folks are traveling, or in any space where faculty are not around. So really, like, getting young people to get their pods together, their support pods, their accountability pods, really working with departments to think about what values that they're actually motivated to uphold and who's going to do that work when, creating classroom spaces where there's, like, even things like community support leads in the space, where they know for that session, they are responsible for intervening if something happens. So they get to practice what it looks like to intervene, to rehearse together what a de-escalation strategy might look like, how to do that, because that's part of the problem. We don't know how. Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate you naming, like, the skill. I mean, when I think about you describing the theater department, it's like, if I was in a department and we actually even had conversations with students, faculty, and staff before doing anything else about the possibility that sexual violence could occur between us, yes, and that we all might already have experienced it in our lives, and how does that, like, that we're all walking in here with whatever mix of knowledge and misinformation about sexuality, consent, gender, and what do we all need to be safe? We might prevent sexual violence just by even having that conversation. We're already signaling that it's not acceptable in our department. We're already like they're just like a kind of skilling, because I feel like what the university usually does is just be so afraid of being sued that it's like, don't talk about anything unless we're doing a Title IX process in which there'll be most likely no findings, like you're saying. So I'm just thinking about, maybe you would say more about like, and you also talked about the kind of skills that you're asking these deans to build, skills of discernment of like, we want to support survivors. We're not just going to like comply with whatever the university lawyers say, like without even thinking, which I think is people, that's so typical at all kinds of institutions. Like, oh, some lawyer said something, I guess we can't do anything. Like it's so easy to just disempower people from doing any pragmatic problem solving or any actual support. And then the harassment continues from the person who's been doing it, who got no findings. So I'm just kind of curious if you could say even more about like skill building you'd like to see among students, among faculty, among staff, among people in the community surrounding the university. Just like, what are skills that we are missing, and are there ways people can be building those skills on their campuses?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the first thing I tell people is that transformative justice is not the panacea for all problems. So I think it's important to name that it's not a solution to everything, and that it is worth looking at in two kinds of instances for me. The first instance is in situations where the current response actually causes more harm. So that's a skill in and of itself. How do we assess when our current response is causing more harm? So getting people to learn how to assess what is harm, being able to name it, to be specific about the behaviors that are problematic. I think part of the challenge is that we're so busy calling people perpetrators and this and that we're not naming the problematic behaviors we want to see different. So there's a whole slew of behaviors that are not technically illegal, but that we still need to change, right? So getting people to get specific is a skill unto itself. The other place where transformative justice is useful to me is where there is no response. And so what that is an invitation for people to get together, to get clear about what is the actual problem. And I'll give you an example that's not about sexual violence, but you can see how it can relate. In one space that I was in, we were talking about one of those community food banks that was sort of accessible in the neighborhood that people were depositing resources in, got vandalized. And people were very upset about it getting vandalized, and they took to the chats on, the local community. And then they started accusing these thugs. No one knew who did it, right? But you know how quickly that gets escalated. And then we're advocating for increased surveillance and police. So when we get folks together and we think through that example, and I say, well, what is the harm here? What constitutes the harm here? And for some people, the harm was that the food didn't make it to the people that needed it, right? That's one kind of harm. For another person, the harm was that they felt unsafe because their neighborhood had been vandalized. For another person, the harm was, well, the escalation in the social media, because now they're inviting police into the neighborhood, and there's people of color in the neighborhood who don't want that. So how we get to understand the harm is not any one person's understanding. It can only be made possible through conversations with each other, where we can get to a collective understanding of what constitutes the harm. If we outsource that process to the state, they're going to tell us what's wrong on their terms. And it's a one-size-fits-all model. And then they're going to tell us what the solution to that is. And when that happens, they're going to look back at you and say, don't you feel like justice was served? Right? So you're really, giving your power away when you outsource that kind, those kinds of problems to someone else to figure out what the real harm is. That's a skill. It's hard to be able to distinguish between someone who feels racist and someone who's enacting very concrete racist behavior. If we can name what the racist behavior is, now we can change something. We can say, listen, don't do this. And we can work on that. And then we can figure out, what does it look like to create networks of support around people who cause harm, as well as people who have been harmed? And that's hard. That first one is very difficult, because a skill set is learning how to manage your own anger and your own shame when you do when you do stuff that's wrong. Right? So there are skills to be had there around managing anger, managing shame, right? And learning how to support people as opposed to outsourcing them to someone else's neighborhood, which is what we do when we kick someone out. Sure, it solves the problem technically, but it leaves the institution completely untouched. And part of the thing that I encourage people to do is that every conflict gives us an opportunity to re-examine what we care about, so our values. And I do a lot of values work with people, in part because some of the frustration for survivors is that we're asking people to step into values that they actually never said that they agreed with. And so getting them to commit to articulate values is about creating a container for accountability. Without the container, we're inviting people to a party that they never said they wanted to be a part of. So this is part of the work, right? How do we create containers for accountability? And then how do we teach people to invite folks back in? And that includes things like, and I'll just share this one last skill thing, and then I'll keep it moving. How do we learn to sit in those difficult conversations when we have to invite someone back in? So one of the workshops that I do with people is asking them explicitly, how do you want to be given information that you find difficult? And have them name in front of others where it's witnessed and documented. If you have something hard to say to me, invite me this way, send me an email, talk to me at this hour, like that specific, so that people have very concrete instructions about how to invite you back into the party when you're out of alignment. It doesn't solve everything, but it does offer the kind of specificity that gives people a pathway towards change. And then if people don't want to be accountable to that, then we have to figure out a harm reduction model. At that point, we're not in TJ, but sometimes we also have to deal with the fact that no system can make someone accountable who doesn't want to be. So part of the work that we're doing is creating the environment where people actually want to be accountable to each other.
I really appreciate that. And just thinking about the way the universities is set up, like the university is all about elitism, right? Like if there's anything we've learned from the Me Too moment, it's like again and again that institutions actually protect harm doers. They actually put people in situations where they're untouchable. Like certain people are untouchable. They have so much influence. And the university does that. Like the high level administrator, the famous professor, the student activist who's so celebrated. And those people can hurt people again and again. And so elitism itself, which the university is based on, makes this, it like encourages and promotes harm. And I just want to acknowledge in the chat that Priscilla Moreno, who's a former Seattle University student, is here talking in the chat about what she experienced at Seattle University, which is exactly this, where the Seattle University not only failed to protect her, but like the leadership of Seattle University came out on the side of her abuser, who went on to abuse many other people. And that is just, I just so appreciate that you're here, Priscilla, and you've asked some really great questions in the chat that I hope we'll get to during the Q&A so we can hear Xhercis's take, but I hope people will read Priscilla's letter that I think she's posted in the chat. And I just appreciate student activists who've been also helping her get her story out. I think there's a lot about what happened to Priscilla that is unfortunately really baked into university structure and the ways that the person who harmed her used, like campaigned to make himself like to get people on his side. And that's just like such a typical story that we see both in universities and outside. So thank you, Priscilla, for being here and speaking out. Xhercis, I'm wondering if you would be willing to talk about what has surprised you in the work. Like, what are lessons that we all should be learning from what you're doing? Like, I think there's probably people here at this event who are in campus sexual assault prevention offices or are working at universities who are charged with this work. There are people here who are students, who are faculty, who do this work out in the community. I'm just curious, like lessons learned, things that have surprised you as you've been doing this very like difficult and complex work.
Yeah, so I think some of the things that have been a really important lesson for me is how important it is for people to have a place to rehearse that's non-judgmental and people to think with, to problem solve. So one of the things that has been really important is identifying folks who are organically poised to do that work, to skill them up to be frontline folks. So for example, at one of the universities I work at, they have this role that's supposed to help new faculty negotiate any obstacles to their, to their intellectual growth. But they often become the person that folks turn to say, ugh, these people in my department are enacting this kind of harm or that kind of harm, or this person is like really doing sexual harassment, whatever it is. So they become these frontline people who, if just given a few skills and teamed up with another person at another college who's doing the same work, they can function as sort of in-house facilitators where people can problem solve and brainstorm. And I think that having rehearsal spaces where people get to try out community-based responses that are not about getting the institution to swoop in and file a grievance and do all that stuff, it's been really interesting to see how people are empowered by that and are taking those skills back home to their families, to their communities, right? So that's something that I am finding I'm surprised by. I have been surprised by the degree to which administrators that I've worked with are actually willing to push in places that I would have never imagined in a million years that, they would be organizing in these ways, questioning provosts, presidents, and so on and so forth. I think oftentimes because faculty frame administrators as the devil, and that's not always the case, right? So what's important about that is that recognizing that we all have different capacities, and deans are set up to have the capacity to mobilize resources in a lot of ways that faculty are not. So they have to be part of the conversation. So that's one thing. I think I've been surprised at the level of creativity that people have come up with. So at one institution, there was a professor who was making people feel very uncomfortable, nothing legally violating, as it were, but uncomfortable nonetheless. And people did reorganized this person's office to create more distance between the door and students so that students would feel less comfortable, so that not everything is a policy, not everything, like we don't always have to generate a policy. Sometimes it's as simple as saying, this person, part of what allows this person to cause harm is the way their office is structured or where their office is located, right? Like I had one, person whose office was located in a basement, and one of the conversations was put this person in a fishbowl, like make them feel witnessed, right? So it doesn't always, those are harm minimizing strategies. They're not TJ all the way, but they allow us to get closer to something that doesn't allow for so much harm to happen. I think that the other thing I want to say is that I invite people to do budget analysis of how much money is being allocated towards protecting the institution from liability, they are so willing to spend so much money on lawyers and mediation and grievances. When you calculate those dollars, you're not getting a lot for your money, right? It's actually cheaper to build in some of these, more in-house facilitators that can help support people through conflict so they have the bandwidth to show up for serious forms of harm. When you erode that capacity by not responding to microaggressions, by not responding to the daily, kinds of harms, then there's no bandwidth left for these big things. And people need to come together to support folks for these big things. So I'm surprised at how willing universities are to spend money on things that actually don't, transform anything. So those are some of the things that strike me as of interest. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like our cities spend half their budgets policing poor people and run entire courts just to put lock homeless people up for sleeping outside. But God forbid they spend money on housing, that is just, it feels like this prevention versus punishment thing is so deeply set up and everywhere, and the university mimics it. Yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying. There's something else I wanted to ask you from it. Well, I lost it. Yeah, I think maybe we should go to people's questions. I think that Sophie and Hope have been collecting some and are going to put them in our little private chat for us. Oh God, there was something else that I really wanted to ask you, but maybe I'll come back.
It'll come to you. It'll come to you. I promise.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think about Priscilla's case as an example at Seattle University. And Priscilla asked in the chat, how can a university deal with something after it's happened? It's been several years since Priscilla graduated, and I'm just curious if you've seen examples. I wish that Seattle University would take up what happened to Priscilla, make a public apology, name what occurred, and ask itself, what are all the things that could have gone different at the time? What could have been in place? Work with Priscilla and other survivors. What are things that could have been in place that would have changed it? And part of that is I'm interested in your story about the fishbowl, how social pressure and social norms are so much what create an environment that's ripe for sexual violence, and we can change social pressure and social norms. So we can have people say, hey, knock it off to people who they have to listen to, or they believe. And right now we do the reverse. We're the university won't say anything to anyone to stop anything until it's gone through this ridiculous, Title IX process that's virtually impossible for survivors. So anyway, I'm just kind of curious, obviously the Larry Nassar case is an example where he abused hundreds of people. He's now been imprisoned, but the university is still dealing with the fallout. I'm just curious if you would share thoughts on when these things are unresolved while the student is there, while the faculty member is still there, how universities might respond later.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because the Nassar case, many of his survivors were remained in the town after they left the university, and that was a complicated case because many of those survivors were children, it was like a CSA case, right? Child sexual assault. So very, very complicated. I think that, I think this is where we have to think about what this university is structurally set up to do versus what we want it to do. And so the university is structurally set up to take care of the students that are currently there. It's not set up to deal with historical harm. So the question becomes whether or not, any given survivor feels compelled to want to be part of a conversation about what needs to shift moving forward, and whether or not, and I have deans. What's interesting is that when I talk to deans, I have groups of deans, groups of administrators, groups of faculty who want to do something even if the students are no longer there. There's nothing preventing those folks from acting. There's nothing structurally preventing those folks from doing all kinds of things. And this is where we have to really expand our imagination around what is possible. So for instance, I don't know Priscilla's case, but I do know that in the aftermath of something like a Nassar, a lot of conversations were had around, well, to what extent do we owe people in the community money for having supported through counseling and all kinds of stuff, the fallout of his actions when the institution itself failed to take action. That's an example. We may need to funnel resources out to the community. How do we do that structurally? What are other things that need to happen? And it depends. It's very context specific. But I think some of the things are what's currently available to respond. For me, I'm always looking for opportunities where, to your point, Dean, we don't just accept what a lawyer says is what we can and can't do. And I think in conversation with survivors can say, okay, well, I need these resources allocated so that I can work on my healing. Like I would be curious to see what kind of asks we could help support survivors to come up with that would actually contribute to your healing, to your well-being, to your, quote, making things better, if not right, better, right? And those questions are not part of any processes that we currently have.
Yeah, that's what I was so moved this year when Seattle U students started a survivor support group, because even like there's nothing like that. Like there's not, a lot of people show up at school, they're already survivors, so they might want and need support entering a new community. And then also things are happening throughout your time in the institution. And like to even just have an acknowledgement that people are in that crisis. And what if we additionally had like funds for people if they need to move suddenly, or ways to access counseling that are beyond what's available, very limited. Like a lot of schools, like I know Barnard, I was recently at an event at Barnard, people were talking about how there's only like one LGBT person in the counseling center, like yes. You might have someone who speaks your language or who has your, who's culturally right for your healing process, or that may not be the kind of healing that is the right one for you, et cetera. I mean, we can imagine a university deciding to, the university spends so much time thinking about how to support like faculty with funds for research, like we could support, et cetera. Yeah, I'm curious about that. One question that is in the chat, Xhercis, is for people curious about the difference between restorative and transformative justice. A lot of people have heard the term restorative justice. Would you share what you think the distinction is?
Yes. I think, first of all, historically, restorative justice comes from indigenous communities, which, because folks had relationships to each other, those processes are transformative. However, the way they've been appropriated out of indigenous communities and thrown into all kinds of places, we can't take those relationships for granted. Those relationships are not there and don't pre-exist, right? And the way they've been implemented in a lot of institutions is that they will give you a restorative justice option. And I'm only talking about the United States, okay? They will give you the restorative justice option in the aftermath of you being found guilty of XYZ. So what part of my concern with that is that they leverage the punishment in order to get participation in the restorative process. Transformative justice is really trying to figure out how we can create the conditions where you don't have to leverage harm and violence to get participation. It's really looking for true accountability where you are motivated to change your behavior if you cause harm. You have the support to do so. And the institutions are not left untouched. So there's an attention to the structural dynamics that enabled the harm to happen. So it doesn't just kind of focus on the interpersonal aspects of a given harm. So I don't see them as mutually exclusive. I see them as on a continuum. In the United States, that appropriation creates some tension around the leveraging of the punishment to get participation. That doesn't mean that people who have participated in those processes have not found them transformative. In some cases they are, in some cases they're not. So all this to say, and I think the other thing about transformative justice is that its roots really live in queer and Black and brown communities that have continuously found themselves under carceral assault. So these are folks who are structurally abandoned by the state, where when you call for help, more violence happens. So in the absence of having access to a response that can be actually helpful and not cause harm, folks said, well, we need something. And we're not happy with just, so when you hear things like don't call the police, it's not illogical, it's not irrational. It's coming from communities that have been structurally abandoned by the state, and have been targeted for death and murder and extreme violence by the state. So those roots are slightly different. And I think the important thing about this is that it takes up the interpersonal and the structural. It does not leave the structural untouched. And this is where Title IX becomes a problem for me, because it says we have this bad apple, we're going to fire this person, and then we don't have to look at all the dynamics at the institution that allowed the thing to happen. All these faculty who knew about XYZ and didn't do anything. Everyone who, because this person had too much prestige, or the tenure process that made certain people untouchable, because they bring in a lot of grant money or whatever it is, right? So transformative justice really is thinking about that. And the other thing it says is you don't have to wait for the institution to come save you. You don't. There's a lot of things that you can do. And I really want to uplift the work of the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. Their pod mapping tool is a gold mine for young people who are new to a place, don't know anybody, and really need to start thinking about putting on a map, on a little chart, who they would contact if they ever found themselves in trouble. You can do that work long before you get in trouble. You can figure out where resources are that are particular to you and put it on that map, on that tool, long before you get in trouble. So to your point, Dean, if you need a Black therapist, if you need a trans therapist, if you need somebody who understands these issues and they're not in your university, are they in the town? Do I have to Zoom them in? Like what? So really mapping out where resources are long before it becomes a problem.
Yeah, maybe people already are. I'm not looking at the chat right now. Maybe if somebody's willing to put the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective pod mapping link in the chat, and also the transformharm.org website, which is full of information about transformative justice, and also the Building Accountable Communities videos that Hope and Miriam Kaba made that help people think these things. Maybe Sophie and Hope can put those in the chat. I mean, when I think about the TJ RJ difference too, I just want to name, like, to me, transformative justice means we don't use the cops. And the reason that not all restorative justice does use cops by any means, but restorative justice, a lot of it has been incorporated into court and policing systems, or like cities will have like a prosecutor who does restorative justice. And what folks have said is it fundamentally doesn't change who gets arrested and who gets punished. So it's like the police are the same, the court's the same. And then it's like you're saying, like somebody gets a charge or some kind of conviction or some kind of thing hanging over them, and then they maybe will get this option, but it's very police involved. So it's really just like the same stuff targeted at the same individuals, like like upper class white men can engage in sexual violence with impunity, and like working class people of color, people with disabilities, all the people who are over policed are going to end up with charges for every possible thing that did or didn't ever happen. That's untouched, and there's no going to like, what are the conditions that we're all responsible for that made this likely to happen? So it's very disempowering if it's just about like, if we use that version, which restorative justice, that's not its principle. That's just how it gets adopted into criminal systems. But if we use that individualizing version, it feels like there's very little most of us can do besides try not to sexually assault people. There's no like us assessing like, well, what is it about the way our friend circle is working, or our social scene, or our music scene, or the way sports happen at this college, or the way drinking happens or the way transportation happens, that we could all like do something about, so that this would be less likely to happen to people. And survivors usually have a lot of takes on that. Like, oh yeah, if I'd had better access to housing, or if people hadn't said these kinds of things to me. And sometimes harm doers have something to say about that. Like, I thought this about sex, or I felt this would make me important or really good at my gender role, or like there's stuff that we could all change that like make it happen less. And that I think TJ really orients us towards both addressing and preventing, but like beyond just the individual, includes the level of like, what does someone who's been hurt need, and what do people who've done harm need to do to stop doing it?
Yeah. And I mean, that's also part of the skill sets, right? Like, how do we look at the people who are co-signing the behavior, especially when you know it's like, even if you're the person who's causing harm and you don't want to become disconnected from your people, but they're co-signing problematic behavior. How do we navigate that in real time? What kind of skills do we need to do that, right? Also, how do you step into responsibility? That is really hard to do. And one of the skills that I invite people to do is cut your teeth on small stuff as often as possible, to really not be afraid to fall or fumble. And, you know, I want to big up Mariam Kaba's and Shira Hassan's Fumbling Towards Repair, because it's really useful to think about like not being, that failure is part of it, right? That we can't be afraid to fail to the point where we allow things to keep happening. So practice stepping into responsibility and not making people chase you. I mean, that's a big one. That and what does it mean to have some support to craft an acknowledgement of harm? Like, that's some of the work that I've been doing, coaching people to craft acknowledgements of harm, which really take up, you know, the navigation of shame, what this means for reputation, all of the stuff that comes with admitting when you did something wrong, and all the consequences that come with that, and how to navigate that is part of the support necessary. Because otherwise, people are going to do what they're going to do. They're going to run, because they know the minute they say they did this thing, they're going to lose everybody. And the more disconnected people become, the more likely they are to cause harm.
Yeah. Somebody asks in the chat about how there's been an explosion of funding for diversity and inclusion work at staffing and training. And I'm guessing, you know, and especially in response to the uprising. So universities are all saying, "Oh wait, now we care about anti-Black racism, and we're going to try." How can that? How is that related to TJ work on campus? I mean, you're directly working with all these campuses. Are you seeing some new possibilities with some of that infrastructure expanding, and how that might help with TJ work? Are you concerned about any dynamics? Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it depends on the institution. I mean, in some institutions, you know, they're open to using a kind of like TJ-esque approach to addressing some of these DEI issues, because they don't have a structural response. Sometimes I get concerned with the way they hire DEI folks, because they're sort of oriented towards grievance and anti-bias reports and stuff like that don't really have a lot of support to either help people clarify what's problematic about the behavior and what needs to change. And they definitely don't have resources to support somebody through a change in what they're doing daily, you know? And they're actually unsustainable as models, because at the end of the day, I see this happen all the time. Someone says, okay, you're enacting racist behavior in the classroom. Stop doing that. You get the boss to tell the person, stop doing that. The chair, the whoever, the dean, the provost, whatever. And they're like, okay, I'll stop doing it. But the truth of the matter is, that person, that administrator, that chair cannot be in your class all the time. So they don't really have a way to sustainably keep the thing going. So I don't know that they're in competition, because they're not even in the same, like TJ isn't really a thing in a lot of institutions. I think now there's a moment where there's this eruption of folks interested in transformative justice, trying to create all these centers, which, to be honest, are, I think, I was in conversation with Miriam Kaba, where, and I understand this concern, this orientation to now like certify people to be practitioners and generate more income for the institution. Right. And that's problematic. Like, the work that I'm doing is not certifying anybody. It's not even about that. It's really thinking about, okay, what is the harm? Where are the resources available to transform the harm? What does the person who was harmed need in order to make things right? Have a sense of well-being, have some say over what happens next. Can we start creating spaces where people can do this on their own without hoping that the institution's going to save them? Because the institution's primary interest is liability. It's always going to be liability. That's how it's structured. So at the same time, these institutions, we have to do something, because we are at a moment in our history where people cannot opt out. To be honest, we know bachelor's degrees function like high school diplomas right now, right? So people are being asked, and I talk about this, people are being asked to go into debt for a degree that doesn't really offer them that much more in terms of future possibilities. So, and more people of color are being funneled into the institutions than ever before. We have to do something. And it's not set up to protect that influx of people, nor, like, on top of the fact that you're going into debt, you got to get abused. Like, thank you, but no thank you. Like, we have to do something. So thinking of groups as little, like little opportunities to organize together. And how do we give them the tools to do that so that we don't have to wait?
I love what you're saying too, because I just feel like there's part of living in an authoritarian society is that we are encouraged to be passive and to see any institution as like it's going to solve it. Like, we got to call somebody else to solve this instead of us. And so much of what TJ values is the possibility that collective action is the only thing that's going to change any of the conditions we're living under, instead of that it's going to come from elites who, of course, are disinterested. They're only interested in not getting sued, which means the best thing for them to do is say the harm never happened, because then they might be responsible if they say it happened. So I appreciate that. Question that came in the chat that I think is a really common question when people are thinking about transformative justice is, what do you do when the person who did harm won't engage?
Well, I'll be honest. Like I said, no structure can make someone accountable if they don't want to be accountable. So if the person doesn't want to engage, then we have to go to harm reduction mode. And for me, that includes things like, if the person, if the survivor is looking for, not wanting to run into that person, on campus, how can we both figure out ways to make that a possibility, organize departments, organize faculty, staff to be a part of that project? It's been part of the work that we've been doing, trying to get people to think in those ways, because for the most part, there's this orientation towards, if there's an active investigation, hands off. Don't get involved. There's an investigation. You did your due diligence. You filed the report. And most people are left in the dark. They don't know what happens after that. And rupturing that silence is also part of the work. We need to tell people what's happening. And so one of the things that we're doing is, and I'm looking for co-conspirators in this. So I'm inviting people who want to think along these lines to help us think about how to think creatively around confidentiality. We have to think creatively around it. On the one hand, survivors want it for different reasons. On the other hand, we have to rupture parts of it if we want to get the community involved in making something different happen. So we have to get very nuanced about how we think about confidentiality, silence, what's private information, what's not. How do we leverage, for example, things that have come out in the news? So it's not a violation, right? Like, I mean, we have to really start thinking creatively. I've gotten to the point where, I mean, to be honest, I've tried to think of all kinds of things. Like, you know, I haven't done this, but I've thought about it. And this is what I'm just uplifting it as the degree of creativity, like becoming a clergy person so that I have confidentiality. Like, so I can say, are you telling me this is your professor or as your clergy person? Like, this is what I'm talking about, like getting very creative about how to maximize the places of confidentiality for people that need that, and rupture silences where we need to rupture silences so that something transformative can happen. And so I'm inviting co-conspirators to do that. We're often trying to think about that in real time when things are happening, but it's better to have fire drills, right? Like to practice with other people case scenarios. Like, what would you do if this was happening to you? How would you respond to this thing? And just to give you an example, I do this as assignments. One of the assignments that I've charged my students to do is to go to a frat party and really map the way the party is organized in a way that could cause harm, what's contributing to it, map out the escape paths before they go to the party. Like, get access to the house, find out how many ways to get out of the building, like roll deep. Don't show up to that party with one person, show up to that party with 4 or 5 people. So really getting folks to rehearse proactive ways of being in space together where people are taking responsibility for each other and proactively looking for ways to get out as opposed to reacting when, without some planning. And even thinking about other creative things. And I'll share this one last one. And I remember one time I was in a hotel room with other actors for one of these performances we were doing, educational theater at the time. And the person next to me, the person in the room next to me was clearly being beaten. We could hear it. We could hear the person being thrown against the wall. Like, we don't know them. It's a stranger situation. So thinking, what are the range of things we could do to stop the violence, but that doesn't like invite more harm to the person that may be, that's already being harmed. And if it wasn't for groups, TJ groups, harm-free zone groups, it would never occur to me to pull the fire alarm as a method to stop the violence, but not call the cops, right? Like, there are creative ways to intervene if you know the people and if you don't know the people. But it takes thinking with others to figure out, now that's not going to solve the problem long term, but it's certainly not going to, it's going to stop the violence in that moment, and it's not going to create more of a danger for the person because now the cops have been called and now I'm mad at you about that. So there are ways that we need to be thinking with each other for harm reduction, for de-escalation, for intervening, for supporting each other before and in the aftermath. And I'm inviting people to get as creative as possible.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think about this question a lot. I feel like this is maybe one question I'm asked most often, about the person who doesn't want to participate in the TJ process. And I always think about this. A lot of the work I do is with smaller organizations where there's conflict, movement orgs and stuff. And I remember this situation in which I was working with some board members, talking to some board members of a group where somebody had an addiction. They had run the org and they stole the money, and the org had to close, and people in the community really needed this org. So it was really heartbreaking. And the person split, they left the state.
Right.
So the only option seemed like, do we work really hard to try to get some kind of cops to go after this person who's like a person from our community who has an addiction, but who has done this, a couple orgs turned out. Or do we work really hard to get people in our community to never let orgs have only one person looking at the money? Like that, the structural problem, so it's like, yes, we want that person to stop doing this, but what if we make it so that it's much harder for anybody to ever do this? Because it's not just that one person. A lot of people stealing money, like a lot of people, we live in a society where that's kind of a setup. So just like not becoming totally disempowered when
Yes.
the harm doer doesn't want to participate, I think is really like, I think a lot of people, because since our criminal system is only set up with the fantasy of making the harm doer pay, people are like, that's success and nothing else matters. And that's actually like, doesn't prevent it from happening again.
No.
And is a really poor substitute for success. And like, just the reality, like we live in a society which we can't always make that person suddenly have a totally new outlook, because the entire society is aligned to say the violence is okay usually. So like, that's going to happen from time to time. People are going to be like unwilling to, or unable to like be deeply accountable. And that shouldn't be the end of the story for the community. So I just feel like TJ, really, like that's what it has taught me, is like a really different discernment around where was the harm, as you were saying before, and what could be a range of outcomes that would heal or prevent, instead of just like this one outcome about this person. I realize that we're down to just 2 minutes. And Xhercis, I wonder if there's anything you want to like say up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing about what you were just saying. And one of the things that I often do is look to see if that person has any relationships that we can bring to bear to bring this person in. Because maybe they don't respond to me, they don't respond to the person they've harmed, but they might respond to that other person. So first of all, let's look at their relationships. Is there someone to bring them in? And then the second part is, I can't have my healing be held hostage to that person coming to the table. So I just want to say that one project is really just about figuring out what you need to be well, and it can't all be hinged on somebody else's ability to step into that responsibility. So just to add to that, yeah. And then the last thing I would say is try as many things as possible, y'all. Don't be afraid to fail. Look at interrupting criminalizations, a million tiny experiments. Knock on a lot of doors, but keep trying and keep negotiating with each other, even when it's hard.
Thank you so much, Xhercis. I'm gonna turn it over to Hope to close us out.
Hi, I just want to say a huge thank you to both of you. This conversation was just, I mean, I learned so much, and also I know how necessary it is being on a campus, hearing, you know, so many questions that you raised, Dean, come up over and over again. So getting to hear from you, Xhercis, about your experiences with these things and how to deal with them. And I also I loved the emphasis on the continual experimentation, you know, which is something that I hear over and over again, and really thinking about like, what are the resources that we already have, and how can we skill up so that we can prevent a lot of this harm before it even happens, and transform the structures and the situations that we find ourselves in to prevent harm before it happens, and also to give people the resources that they need to be able to deal with harm when it happens, that isn't just looking towards the university to protect them or save them, because, you know, a lot of, you know, that might or might not happen for them. So knowing that you can build these skills for yourself and have resources available for yourself is just so important. So really, thank you both so much. Thank you also to our ASL interpreters tonight, and our captioner, and to Sophie, who's working behind the scenes. Yeah, I just want to close it out and just say good night to you both, and I hope that we can continue this conversation in the future.
Yes. Good night, y'all. Thank you. Bye.